felt like the right time to enter the market. It feels like there's a lot of opportunity. Localization goes far, far beyond translation.
160,000 new commercial registrations in Q4 just gives you an idea of the level and scale of international expansion into the kingdom.
The core of it is in your message there, is around respect.
What would you say has been the most surprising thing, perhaps, to you when looking at Saudi Arabia?
One of the things I find incredibly exciting about this region is you have...
Welcome to the Grow in Saudi podcast. Grow in Saudi, powered by Peninsula, is designed to give insights, feedback, and expertise to anyone looking at expanding into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'm delighted to welcome today's guest, Andrew from Pieo. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you ever so much for having me on today.
My pleasure. Today we are discussing business expansion in Saudi and beyond. And one of the main themes that we'll be discussing today is the digitalization of the Saudi economy, the consumer behavior in Saudi Arabia, and also a little bit on the expansion process. So, Andrew, thanks again for joining us. And perhaps if I could start by asking you on your experience of Saudi Arabia. Obviously, Pieo is doing lots around the kingdom and beyond. So please give us your thoughts on Saudi Arabia's journey and growth so far.
It's been incredible to watch, but also looking at the pace. The pace of change appears, to me, to have really stepped it up in the last couple of years. I've been personally myself been in the region now for almost 10 years, and I think witnessing that transformation has been incredible. It really is. You see the points you raised there around the digitization of the economy. It's very much opening up. I think there's a lot of misconceptions I sort of see for Saudi, but being a lot closer to it now, you can sort of really see the opportunities and see where companies can really make an impact, particularly when they align with Vision 2030.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. The pace of growth in Saudi Arabia, I'd say particularly over the last 3 years, has been aggressive, one could almost say. And I think is only going to continue. Obviously, we're now in the latter stages of Vision 2030, which is the pioneering initiative which has transformed the Saudi economy and particularly digitalized the economy into what it is today. Tell us a little bit about Pieo, if you would, and a bit about what you offer and how the products and services you offer can potentially help businesses going into the kingdom.
Absolutely. So I think the main difference for us at Pieo is we're very, very focused on results. We're focused on revenue. I think a personal frustration I've had over years of working in marketing is, too much emphasis on vanity metrics, impressions, things that don't move the needle. Working in startups and founding my own business as well, like I really understand the importance of runway and, that you have to be making impact. One of the things I always say is impressions don't pay salaries. So it's, really about looking at understanding what works for a particular business rather than, forcing a playbook that might have worked for another company in another region. It's about really understanding the nuances of, what does success look like in a local market, and how can you translate that into a plan for a specific business. So I think that's one thing that I'm really excited to talk about today, is around that aspect of localization. I think one thing I've noticed over my time here is the increase in companies entering the market, entering the region from very, very different markets. Take the UK, the US, you see a lot of companies coming over here. And I think one of the big challenges for them is, how do you balance a local approach while still adhering to the global guidelines of a particular company? And I think that's, I've worked with several large global brands, Adidas being one of them. And you've got very, very strict guidelines on how to work with a particular brand, but they tend to be developed by people that have worked their entire career in Europe or worked their entire career in the United States. And I think it's about understanding the nuances and that localization goes far, far beyond translation, particularly in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid point that you raise. I think, particularly on that international brand and their approach to localization, we've also encountered similar, not challenges, but I think similar different ways of working. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is a unique place to do business. It's, as we've mentioned, very focused on providing services digitally. Your consumer behavior is very digital led, but also in terms of expansion and growing relationships within the kingdom, those require a lot of in-country, in-person, face-to-face work as well. And I think, you raise a really good point. International brands are having to adapt. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is on everyone's map, but understanding what it takes to not only set up, but scale, grow, develop relationships within the kingdom, I think is a real skill and an art that international brands are obviously clearly adapting to and evolving. We see that through the company registration numbers in Saudi Arabia. I mean, Q4 had the highest number of companies set up in the kingdom, over 160,000 new commercial registrations in Q4. And that just gives you an idea of the level and scale of international expansion into the kingdom. I think you're making really strong points on how they're having to adapt to localization, local processes, and local ways of working. What would you say has been the most surprising thing, perhaps, to you when looking at Saudi Arabia? Obviously, you're doing some business there yourself now. What has shocked you? What didn't you expect? Please tell us.
I think for me, what I found interesting is when working with global companies in the past, they tend to cluster markets. So, you'll have like somebody looking after MENA as an example, or someone looking after Europe or the Americas. And what really strikes me is that the behavior from Saudi Arabia, even to the UAE, shares a land border.
Yeah.
Often we get clients that assume that they can take the same approach in both markets, but actually they're quite different. Even starting from consumer behavior. You mentioned about the digitization of the Saudi economy. I think that's something that's really, really ramped up over in recent years. But what's fascinating is when you look at consumer trends. One of the things I love doing with clients is working on strategy and identifying opportunities. And when you get down to channel strategy, it could be, forgiven for making assumptions that what you see in the UAE might be what you see in Saudi, but actually it's very, very different. Like video consumption in Saudi Arabia is very, very high. The primary social media channels are TikTok, Snapchat, and a lot of X usage as well, and also YouTube. But what you tend to see is like market penetration. So one example is, you look at the United Arab Emirates, sort of 90% market penetration on Facebook. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's less than 60%. And then you look at Snapchat and it's reversed. Like Snapchat has very, very high market penetration in Saudi Arabia and less than 40% in the UAE. So there's real nuances even from country to country in terms of, okay, well, you've decided on your marketing message, you know how you want to enter the market, but then it's the channel strategy that really is quite different. And another sort of secondary point on that is the hours of consumption. If you look at channel usage, Saudis are spending over an hour a day on TikTok. They're spending an hour a day on YouTube on top of their consumption on TikTok. It's a very video first, mobile first. It's video consumption on mobile that is very, very high engagement. Even compared to the UAE, which also globally is quite high engagement in terms of digital adoption. So what we're seeing is obviously a very different trend to the UAE, which is Saudi Arabia is one of the closest neighbors. How do you think firms are adapting to that are expanding into the kingdom, where we're seeing a lot of
a lot of questions around this when they are setting up. They are asking, okay, tell us a bit more about those consumer trends that you've just mentioned. How do you think those international firms, those Fortune 500 blue chip companies, are adapting to that? What have you seen locally in terms of their approach?
I think the ones that are doing it well, and so the best examples of this are really considering cultural context. They're exploring how they can co-create content with Saudi nationals or locals in Saudi Arabia, rather than maybe taking a global advert or a global piece of content and trying to sort of retrofit it to Saudi Arabia. I think you need to be thinking about how do you create content that's native to each channel. What might work on Facebook doesn't necessarily work on TikTok or on Snapchat. I think the other sort of element of this as well is measuring success. Video channels are typically quite hard to measure or to attribute directly, because the reason being is that regardless of how many times you say click on the link in the description, or if you're listening to a podcast it's like, oh, click on the link in the show notes, people just don't do it. Like the common behavior is to absorb the message. If it's a strong message, the message will be absorbed through that sort of video or audio referral, and then the customer will go and search for that product later. So the channels that are successful in Saudi are very much in terms of like demand generation rather than demand capture. So what I'm seeing, the companies that are succeeding is they're really embracing locally created content, video digitally, or digital video first, but then acknowledging that they might see the uplift of that elsewhere. A great example of it is, are you measuring branded search intent? Because video can normally drive branded search intent, and what you'll see is an action that you've taken over here will potentially lead to a sale or even a lead over here. And it's understanding the incrementality of the work that you've done and being able to measure it and understand it, because it's not a market that you can really attribute every single thing directly. And the reason as well I think about that is relationships and word of mouth. Snapchat, WhatsApp, they tend to be one-to-one communication channels rather than broadcast. So what you see is this sort of like waterfall effect of, as a company entering the market, you create a wonderful piece of content that you put out on YouTube, but then somebody shares a snippet of that or talks about that on WhatsApp or maybe sends a snap. That secondary person has actually interacted with your primary content, but because of that, very, very close like relationships and cultural relevance in Saudi, you see people sharing about it, discussing it on channels which, as marketeers, you just simply can't track. So it becomes quite interesting in that sense of, you look at, how can I spark interest? How can I spark demand? You're looking much higher up the funnel to be effective.
Yeah, no, really good points. And I think, again, to touch on relationships, and we've spoken so heavily about how to digitalize your message and positioning to consumers in Saudi Arabia. I think it's the opposite when it comes to actual building relationships and partnerships. That in-country, that in-person, that face-to-face element, for me, and what we've seen certainly cannot be understated. I think a lot of people have tried to sort of dip their toes in, so to speak, into Saudi Arabia and not maybe committed that time or travel into the kingdom. What I've seen is that method won't work anymore. You've got to be there. You've got to be on the ground to build those relationships. Only yesterday I was out and about with several company leaders from the UK, from Turkey, and that was one underlying common that they had, is being here on the ground. You could see from the reception and warmth that they were getting from their counterparties, whether that was government officials, whether it was ministries, was much more impactful than anything they were doing over Zoom or any other digital form of communication. So just to touch on this, what's been your experience in terms of building relationships and partnerships in the kingdom? Are there any key trends that you've seen and that business leaders should be looking out for?
Honestly, I think the core of it is in your message there, is around respect. I think, personal relationships are really, really built on respect. And I think, going to meet locally as opposed to having a meeting on Zoom is a really strong sign of respect, and, helps build those relationships in person. For me as well, I think it's, as a company new to the market, it really depends on what type of product or service you're offering, because I think the relationships that you want to build really, really depend upon that. If you're a B2B company, seeking to tender on a government project, absolutely, you have to be there. You have to be on the ground. Your relationships are very much with the key stakeholders from the government entities that are awarding that tender. But then, if you are e-commerce, as an example, you've seen a huge rise in e-commerce. Very going back to the digitally connected customer. E-commerce, social commerce is really on the rise. That's then a different type of relationship building. Are you looking to then build strong relationships with creators who will create content that reach your target audience? Another one that I find really fascinating at the moment is the growth of the sport and entertainment industry in Saudi Arabia. That's again another form of relationship and partnership that you can build. You look at the investments that Saudi Arabia have made in football, in boxing, MMA, esports, all of these areas, you're going to benefit from building relationships with key influential figures in each of those areas. So, being on the ground, sharing that passion for a particular area, a particular topic, I think is really gonna help. Whether that outcome of that is that you secure the opportunity to tender, or the outcome of that is you build a sponsorship portfolio around a particular entertainment property. I think, all roads lead to strong relationships in that regard. Yeah,
absolutely. I think, again, really, really valid points. And on sports and entertainment, I think anyone watching this that is a sports fan from, as you said, football, and obviously Cristiano Ronaldo, arguably being the most high-profile footballer on the planet now, living and applying his trade in Saudi Arabia, I think has been huge. We've seen other football professionals move over as well. The investment into golf, boxing, the General Entertainment Authority, who's generally leading that drive, and His Excellency Turki Al Sheikh is doing a fantastic job in raising the profile of not only those sports in the kingdom, but Saudi Arabia as a global host for those kind of events and stars. We're moving towards conclusion of Vision 2030. We have the Expo 2030 happening. And of course, then the World Cup in 2034, which arguably is the biggest sporting event on the planet. What do you see as the future of Saudi over the next 10 years? Mentioning some of those events there. How do you think digitalization will continue, improve, maybe even contribute to those events? And what does your outlook look like for the next 10 years?
So for me, I think it's incredibly exciting to see, all of these, world-renowned properties, the sporting entertainment properties coming to Saudi Arabia. I think the outlook is fascinating because you can leverage the growth of that in different ways depending on the type of business you are. If you're a B2B business, not only do these events provide a branding opportunity, they provide incredible hospitality opportunities. Going back to your relationship point earlier, these sporting events can be a key facilitator for you for, building a hospitality program that helps you strengthen relationships in the kingdom. But then it's also, you think about the digitization of that is how can you use those properties, those events to create and capitalize on, or create content to capitalize on culturally relevant moments locally. One of the things that I find, very, very fascinating is you've got this sort of generation of Saudis coming through, many of whom have received education abroad at some of the world's top universities. And they're, sort of coming back to work in government roles, bringing a sort of consumption of media and content from other countries into Saudi Arabia. And I think this is a key factor behind bringing some of these sporting properties here. You have individuals that have gone abroad, experienced what it's like to go to a boxing match in Las Vegas or a boxing match in London, or they've gone and seen the golf, they've seen the Masters and thought, okay, brilliant, or let's sort of build this into the Vision 2030 and sort of really put Saudi on the map from a sports sponsorship perspective globally. But I do think that it's such a strong networking and hospitality opportunity for B2B companies. But then, for B2C, again, it could be an opportunity for networking hospitality, but also it comes back to that co-creation of content opportunity. As a sponsor of a particular one of these properties, what rights do you get to create content with the athletes, with the stars of the show that really show that you respect Saudi Arabia. It's a focus for you, and you want to create content that is locally relevant and build that brand message of yours. Maybe it's a global message, but you've got that local flair and that cultural relevance to it. But going back to your sort of original question around where do you see it going, is I only see it growing at the moment. You look at, even investment in NEOM. It's the diversification of the sports, which I find fascinating. NEOM and their partnership with Supertry as an example. They're really is on a path to, there is something for absolutely everyone. And I think that's another interesting point as well, is attracting more people to the kingdom. You look at the UAE now. UAE, it's about 90% of people living in the UAE are foreign born, whereas in Saudi that number is only 40%. So as you see that growth of the kingdom, you will see more people choosing to relocate, call Saudi Arabia home, and that then also adds an element of localization and thinking about your audience segmentation and understanding that it's is not just one audience in Saudi Arabia. It's lots of almost like micro audiences that may be unified by a common interest.
Andrew, please tell us a little bit about the most common mistakes you've seen with Pieo around companies expanding into the kingdom. We can even widen that beyond Saudi Arabia, maybe even to the Gulf region.
Well, thank you. I think honestly, for me, it comes down to like bundling markets together and not having a market specific strategy. I think we've talked so much today about the localization aspect, relationships, but I think there's a lot within the region. There's a lot of national pride, and what might work in one market, isn't guaranteed to work in another. And I think one of the big challenges is around taking global content and wanting it to work in this market. I saw one such company that they had content that worked very, very well in London. It was a B2C company, content worked very well in London, but they were just running exactly the same ads in the UAE. And you look at it and you look at this person at the front door of a very quaint terraced house somewhere in London.
Yeah.
And you straight away as a consumer, you're like, well, that's not here. And I think it ties back to that respect aspect. I think your customers, whether it's on a B2B or a B2C side, will look far more favorably upon you if it appears as though you have, made efforts to understand them and to engage with them and interact with them in a way that is locally and culturally relevant. Is that something that you've seen from a sort of more general operations side of market entry?
Yeah, definitely. I think we often see many international companies that perhaps don't already have presence in the region. And to go back to Saudi Arabia, I think we do a lot of expansion from UAE into Saudi, and we find that those companies are more well versed with the local nuances and understand a little bit about the key differences between doing business in different countries. You make a very valid point. Doing business in Saudi Arabia is very different to doing business in the UAE and every other country as well. With international companies coming in, I think setting expectations is sort of probably one of the first things that we look to address. And expansion and the expansion journey, not only in Saudi Arabia, but the region, I think is quite unique to the Middle East region. Setting up an entity, expanding a legal entity, redomiciling a legal entity in Europe, the US, is a very different process to what you go through here. So those expectations have to be managed from the outset. I think understanding the local market through qualified, trained local advisors, I think is an absolute must if you don't have regional presence. I'd also implore anyone that is considering expansion into Saudi Arabia, relocation, redomiciling into Saudi Arabia, to go and look at the kingdom itself in person. It's so connected now. Obviously, we've got the national airline Saudia, FlyNAS, Riyadh Air comes online later this year. Getting a flight to Saudi Arabia you can do it from all four corners of the world very easily. And it's a great place to go and visit. I can't emphasize enough the on the ground, the warmth, the hospitality, which we've mentioned today, the welcome that you get from the minute you step off the plane to the minute you get in the taxi to the minute you get to your hotel, is all very consistent, and it's such a hospitable place to go. It's by no means a chore at all. So I would say go out there, spend 1-2 days, go and see the local advisors in their Riyadh office, go and get a feel and get your finger on the pulse of what's going on there. Because if you read the narrative, and the narrative is, of course, growth, excitement, but go and substantiate that yourself in person. That would probably be my biggest tip. And sometimes international companies that aren't doing that, can sometimes be caught off guard and have a slow start to their business journey and life in Saudi. I think preparation, due diligence in any expansion is key, but yeah, it's a great place to visit anyway. So I think you've got to do it if you're looking at it seriously.
You should time the trip around a sporting event as well.
Well,
that's the
exactly
way to do it.
Although I've tried to get tickets to watch Cristiano Ronaldo and Al Nassr, and it's very challenging. I have to say, I have to speak very nicely to our team in Riyadh to see if they can source them when I'm next there. But you're absolutely right. There are so many sporting events now. It's obviously not just football. It's the calendar is jam packed really outside of those summer months.
Is that because your business partner is an Al Hilal fan? Is that why he won't get you Al Nassr tickets?
Yeah, that is true. And he's very much an Al Hilal fan. But no, it's fantastic on TV anyway. The atmosphere looks unbelievable. I'm really excited to get to one. But yeah, as I said, the key sporting events coming up, the World Cup for sure, will be one not to miss, and I'm sure there'll be plenty in between.
Absolutely, yeah. Formula One as well, and the
of course, Formula One's already
yeah.
there, and yeah, there's various other things as well, isn't there? I know Live Golf is really taking off, and golf courses are popping up around the country as well, and it's a great one in Jeddah. And I think, yeah, as you correctly mentioned earlier, there's a sport for everyone now in Saudi Arabia. It's a real forefront of life and day-to-day living there. So Andrew, as the founder of Pieo, you've taken Pieo, founded in the UAE, now into Saudi Arabia. What's been some of the biggest takeaways through that expansion journey for you?
Honestly, I think it was a lot easier than maybe we initially expected, thanks to yourself, Alistair. But for me, I think it was about, the timing for us. It was, it felt like the right time to enter the market. It feels like there's a lot of opportunity for us at Pieo. We tend to work a lot with startups, with scale ups, and you just see more and more of those type of companies are ideal clients entering that market. Obviously, with the introduction of the entrepreneur license, it makes it a little bit easier for younger companies such as ourselves to get in, as long as we obviously meet the requirements around investment, but also as well the opportunities that Saudi Arabia is presenting, for this type of company. The amount of PIF backed incubators and incubators run by PIF affiliated companies is just growing so quickly. And I think that for us, the introductions that you made helped give us a foothold in the market, but also it's then it's connecting with the type of businesses that we really want to be connecting with. Coming back to your point on relationships, for us, it is very much a relationship based sale, and being able to be part of an incubator that is also filled with other founders that are taking their first steps into Saudi Arabia is really, really exciting, and also helps us get traction in that market quite quickly. So I think for me it was I'd very much try to avoid misconceptions, but the misconception that I did have that maybe it would be more difficult and take longer to enter the market than it actually did.
And one question I've been meaning to ask was your business partner's affiliation to Newcastle United, and of course PIF now. Another reason for making the jump into the kingdom?
Absolutely. I think the Carabao Cup win certainly helped validate the decision in his mind. So, unfortunately, as a Plymouth Argyle fan, I have no affiliation. But if anyone in Saudi Arabia does want to invest, we're just about holding on to our championship life. So, but no, I think there's so many reasons now. I think a true testament to our success is if we can have a hospitality box at Newcastle for him in the future, and maybe one at Al Nassr as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned there about the community of startups and the incubator programs that are currently available. Have you found that level of support and cohesion with other founders that are at similar stages of their expansion to you helpful? And how is the community of newly expanded companies in Saudi, and what's your thoughts on that?
I think it's getting stronger all the time. It really is. I think what you're seeing now is that the region is very, very attractive for early stage founders. They really are putting a lot of incentives in. You've got a lot of sort of favorable tax conditions, particularly for the first few years on the entrepreneur license. At a time where there is a lot of frustration with Europe as a sort of home base for for startups. So I think, for so many years, Silicon Valley has been seen as, absolutely the top place in the world to be as a startup founder. But I do think that you are seeing these smaller communities pop up, be that in Dubai or be that in Riyadh, and it's a lot of people trying to solve problems at the same time together. For me, I love problem solving, and being able to sit over coffee and talk through the problems that either we're facing or other businesses as a part of the incubator are facing. It's sort of like help us capitalize on the opportunities together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you make a really important point, actually, and a lot of businesses and business owners and founders are getting fed up of sitting in these high tax jurisdictions and not receiving perhaps the level of support or infrastructure that traditionally has always been there. And they're now looking into the Middle East, and particularly the UAE and, of course, now Saudi Arabia. And I think we've seen through fantastic initiatives like the entrepreneur license from the Ministry of Investment, a lot of those traditional barriers that startups faced when going into Saudi are now being slowly etched away and removed. And Saudi Arabia is almost by the day becoming a more startup-friendly, founder, young business-friendly jurisdiction. So it's great to hear that you've had such a positive experience.
The other thing that I find incredibly exciting, I am a data geek at heart. I love customer research, customer segmentation. One of the things I think is incredible about the region is the diversity. We talked briefly earlier about the percentage of foreign-born individuals living in UAE and Saudi. If you think about maybe starting your business, say you start your business in the UK, at some point you're probably going to want to expand out of the UK and look at growing your total addressable market. US is normally a very popular choice just because it's a single market that gives you access to so many consumers who tend to be relatively similar. I appreciate that there's obviously differences, and I don't want to bundle everyone in the country in the same way, but one of the things I find incredibly exciting about this region is that you have people moving here from all over the world, and I feel it is such a good place to incubate a new product, a new idea, to get product market fit and understand which communities you have product market fit with, because it can give you a roadmap to where you then scale globally. That's what I find so exciting about in this region, particularly if you are a B2C business. You have consumers from such diverse backgrounds that you can almost use the market to plan out your next 5 to 10 years and understanding, okay, well, these are the communities that we have product market fit with. These are the ones that we don't. Okay, brilliant. We need to focus more on that. But actually, this may be the market that we choose to invest in and choose to scale our operations to. It's such a wonderful market for experimentation.
Absolutely. And perhaps we can close with some final thoughts and comments on your journey so far, and we've touched a little bit on the future of Saudi Arabia, but perhaps you can give your thoughts and overview of what the next 6-12 months looks for Pieo and looks like for Saudi Arabia.
Hopefully growth. Definitely, I think growth from a Saudi Arabia perspective. But if we can get some growth for Pieo as well, I'll be very, very happy. I think, what we're seeing is this acceleration towards the culmination of Vision 2030, and that the rate of growth is increasing, and you can see that from so many markers. You see that from the non-oil GDP growth. You see that in particular sectors. We talked about e-commerce earlier. The e-commerce market is so hot at the moment. I think for me it's growth and solving problems and capitalizing on the opportunities that growth creates.
Fantastic. Andrew, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the inaugural Grow in Saudi podcast. We look forward to catching up again soon.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me on, Alistair.
Thank you.
Thank you.